If you've been here at COP26 for any amount of time, you've probably heard the mention of methane. Last week, we got a pledge, the Global Methane Pledge, which the US and the EU put together with 100 countries pledging that they would cut emissions by about 30% by 2030. Just before coming into COP26, G20 for the first time, the 20 countries that account for about 80% of global emissions, said that they recognize methane is a problem and that they will do something about it. Now, why are we suddenly talking about methane? Let's look at the numbers. This might be a familiar chart to some of you. It's going back all the way 800,000 years. If we look at a chart that is about carbon dioxide, that's what it's going to look like. Largely remaining within a certain amount and then suddenly shooting up as we start using fossil fuels. Methane has done the same, but there's a difference. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is about 50% higher than the 800,000 year average that we've had. Methane, on the other hand, is 150% higher. And we care about methane because in the short term, it has a huge warming impact. In the first 20 years of its life, methane traps about 80 times as much heat for the same amount of carbon dioxide that's released in the atmosphere. Even 100 years down, the amount of methane heat is about 30 times as much as carbon dioxide. Now, notice carefully here, the size of methane is decreasing as time goes out. And that's probably the good news, which is methane degrades much more quickly in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide does. And that's what we can use to our advantage. This is a chart showing temperatures starting in 2020 and letting the clock run on the black line as if we are not doing very much beyond what is business as usual. Temperatures would rise 1 degree Celsius by about 2050. If we meet the global methane pledge, they will be about 0.2 degrees Celsius lower. Now, just for context, we are at 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming, and we want to stop warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that 0.4 degrees Celsius is a very small window in which, if methane allows us a 0.2 degrees Celsius head start, that's amazing. This is probably the scariest chart I've seen as a climate journalist. It was tucked in the IPCC report that was published in August this year. Now, let's get the bottom two parts out of the way first. Solar and volcanic drivers. This is telling you what are the different variables that contribute to warming on the planet. Climate skeptic talking points have been, well, climate change has always happened and it's just nature that's running its course. Well, we know that's not the case because neither solar radiation nor volcanic emissions have been able to either cool down or warm up the planet, and any other internal variable that we can track and have been tracking for decades does not contribute. Now, the scary part of this is the second bar, which says all the greenhouse gases that we have emitted are actually enough to already heat the planet by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And yet, the observed warming is only 1.1. That's because, ironically, the same fossil fuels that we use to put out greenhouse gases into the atmosphere also produce particulate matter pollution or aerosols, which have a cooling impact because they produce this layer in the upper atmosphere that reflects sunlight. As we get to net zero, we're going to have to cut fossil fuel emissions, which means we will cut air pollution. That's great for health, but we will get some short-term warming in the process. And using methane as a reduction tool at the same time as you're cutting fossil fuel emissions can help us counteract that short-term warming. That makes methane another reason why we should be acting on it. So how do we do it? Well, let's look at the sources. There are four major sources, right? Livestock, which is mostly growing cows. Oil and gas and coal, marked in orange. Waste, which is coming both from landfill and wastewater treatment. And rice, which is, when it's produced, it produces methane during the production process. Now, what the chart shows is the dark bar is where we have both the technology and the economics behind us to be able to cut methane, which is to say it's actually profitable for almost 50% of all emissions that come from oil and gas to be cut profitably today. And more oil and gas companies aren't able to get away with it. We now have eyes in the skies, satellite monitoring, which can tell us where exactly a leak has come from around the globe. Then we can send people on the ground with specialized cameras to be able to turn an invisible gas visible and then seal those leaks, essentially with sophisticated plumbing. And oil and gas companies are realizing that they are being watched. And so when we as reporters, you will have seen the Bloomberg Green magazine, which has methane as its theme for this issue. When we as reporters go and talk to oil and gas companies, some say, yes, there's a leak, we're going to fix it. Others say, well, those leaks are within legal boundaries. And so we have to, as society, as journalists, hold these companies accountable if we want to cut emissions. And that's crucial because the other part of methane emissions is very hard to cut. So livestock, we don't actually yet have technologies that can be scaled up to be able to reduce emissions. This is a startup based in the UK called Zelp, which is building, as you can see, maybe slightly, masks for cows. And about 90% of emissions that come from cows in form of methane are actually burps. And so you build these masks to be able to trap some of those methane and reduce those emissions. But this is all very early stage, and that's why cutting emissions from the oil and gas sector is even more important. So let's come back to COP26. We got the global methane pledge, which said that we'll be able to cut emissions by about 30% by 2030. And that could really help us give the time that we need to be able to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. But the global methane pledge is actually weaker than it ought to be. Scientists told us that we need to cut emissions for methane 45% by 2030. The target for the global methane pledge is only 30%. It also doesn't have the biggest emitters. India, Russia, China haven't signed up. And it's a global collective pledge, which means some countries have signed up and can get away with doing nothing while others have to do more. And so this is where the change needs to happen, where we've got these pledges and now we need to get into implementation. Cutting methane emissions could be the quickest solution that we can use to try and address climate change. Thank you.